The killings of a New York imam and a Lebanese-American man in Oklahoma are highlighting what some see as growing intolerance against Arabs and Muslims in the United States. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Reports of violence against Muslims have been on the rise since the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the U.S. in 2001. And according to a study by Georgetown University here in Washington, last year saw the highest number yet of reported incidents of violence and vandalism against Muslims. More than 2 states have sought to ban Sharia law, and studies show the number of Americans who view Islam in a negative light has spiked since the start of the U.S. election cycle in 2015. Another recent report claimed the rate of hate crimes directed at Muslims in the U.S. tripled after the terror attacks in Paris and San Bernardino. Joining us now in our Washington, D.C. studio is Nadia Hassan, founder of the Villa Peace Park Coalition and the daughter of a U.S. Marine. From Philadelphia, we're joined by Engie Abdelkader. She is the author of the report When Islamophobia Turns Violent, the 2016 U.S. presidential elections, and she's also a professor at Georgetown University. Also with us is Arjun Sethi, a writer and attorney based here in Washington, D.C. Arjun got a first-hand look at the FBI's Shared Responsibility Committee, a covert counterterrorism program now in beta testing. Thanks to all of you for being here. Andrew, let me start with you in Philadelphia. You know, Islamophobia has been around for quite some time. We saw it sort of come about after the 9/11 attacks. But have you seen a recent rise in Islamophobia in the last election cycle, you know, with the advent of Donald Trump becoming the nominee?
Absolutely. First, thank you so much for having me with you on your program. As you mentioned, we actually conducted a study that looked specifically during this election cycle at the relationship between Islamophobic political rhetoric and acts and threats of violence directed towards American Muslims or those perceived to be, as well as their institutions. Our research actually showed that there was a positive relationship. The findings were actually rather surprising in a number of different ways. Not only did we find that acts and threats of violence against Muslims are at its highest level since any time since September 11th, we also found that Muslim men, and particularly those who are between the ages of 18 and 24, are disproportionately impacted by the most lethal forms of violence. So we actually documented at least 12 murders of those who are Muslims or perceived to be Muslims during this particular election cycle, which we measured from March of last year, when their first candidate announced his intention to run for high office, to March of this year. In addition, we also found that when compared to pre-election level violence, Muslims are still suffering about 3 to 5 times as much acts or threats of violence, which is rather disturbing.
Nadia, we're hearing a lot about Muslims. We're hearing a lot about Islamophobia during this election campaign. Of course, we're hearing a lot about it from Donald Trump. He once talked about banning Muslims, then now he's talking about vetting Muslims. What about the Clinton campaign? During the national convention, we heard Bill Clinton say that if you're Muslim and you love America and you hate terror, then you should be here and stay with us and win. Was that a bit of stereotyping there?
Yes, it was. I did attend the Democratic National Convention, and to my surprise, actually, well, not really, I wasn't that surprised when I heard Bill Clinton's speech. We're hearing a lot of this Islamophobic rhetoric from electeds as well as from the media, and it's part of the narrative. It's part of winning political points. I'm tired of the electeds pandering to the Muslim community to gain political points, and it's really becoming problematic for us. After Bernie lost, the Muslim community is kind of divided on what they want to do. Do they want to vote for Hillary? Do they not want to vote for Hillary? Of course, Trump is not really an option. He's bashing everyone. There's no one that he hasn't really laid into. And so we're kind of sitting here trying to figure out what to do. But what's ironic about this whole thing is that why is it that Muslims are having to be in the spotlight, and the assumptions are that American Muslims don't love America and don't love freedom, when 94% of terrorist attacks on U.S. soil are being committed by non-Muslims. So just the fact that it's being put out there is part of that whole mega Islamophobic machine.
That's right. Far more people are killed by right-wing extremist groups than non-Muslim right-wing extremist groups than by any kind of jihadist groups. Arjun, when you look at these election campaigns, both campaigns, the Democratic and the Republican, have Muslims, in a sense, become convenient whipping boys for politicians here?
Absolutely. Bigoted political rhetoric, recent mass shootings have cultivated an environment in which anyone who looks different is a target, including Muslim Americans and Sikh Americans. In the aftermath of the San Bernardino tragedy, Sikh Americans experienced a 200% uptick in hate incidents. Muslim Americans experienced a 300% uptick in hate incidents. So what we're finding is that this environment has made Muslim Americans, Sikh Americans, and other minority communities acutely vulnerable to bigotry, hate violence, bullying, and even employment discrimination.
Angie, when we look at how this kind of discrimination that Arjun is talking about, how it's being countered, are law enforcement agencies doing their job, or are law enforcement agencies like the FBI or local police forces, for that matter, actually acting in a biased way against Muslims?
No, I think that we find ourselves in a difficult environment. I think there's still a challenge regarding underreporting of these types of incidents. I need to note, actually, that in terms of the report that we put out at Georgetown, that it's not meant to be a comprehensive listing or representation of all of the acts or threats of violence that that community is experiencing. In reality, there's still some distrust of the law enforcement community, particularly in a context of countering violent extremism policies, which seem to disproportionately target the American Muslim community and tends to alienate members of that minority group. And so there is a reluctance, I think, to come forward and to report these incidents of violence to members of the law enforcement community. By the same token, even research shows that even when these incidents are reported to members of the law enforcement community, they don't always make their way into official reports concerning hate crimes. And so it's long been acknowledged by the U.S. Department of Justice, for instance, that while the annual statistics that are published by the FBI about levels of hate crimes that Americans across the country, including Muslim Americans in Sikhs, for instance, but also Jewish Americans and others, that they experience is not actually accurate, right? But it's significant still because it represents a trend. And it's important to note that even in terms of the statistics that we saw come from the FBI in 2014, they showed that hate crimes generally went down against almost every religious group in the United States except for Muslims, right? And then our research shows that those numbers are only continuing to climb. And again, our numbers are not comprehensive. They just represent an upwards trend. And so is there a work that still needs to be done? Absolutely. But I think it's, in order for us to do that work, it's also important to acknowledge the factors that are contributing to the fear and hatred, hostility that is actually feeding into and causing this violence, right, against members of this community. And that includes the political rhetoric, but it also includes some other factors as well. So I think that it's important for us to have that discussion too.
All right, Nadia, if we listen to the political rhetoric that Angie was talking about, if we listen to what Donald Trump is saying, what he's doing, if we look at what the Democratic Party is doing and how it responds to what Donald Trump is saying, you would get the perception that Islamophobia is confined to the extremist fringe groups in this country, but that's not the case, is it? I mean, we see law enforcement agencies spying on Muslim groups, spying on mosques. We see airlines throwing Muslims off planes. For what reason? Because they're dressed in a certain way, because men have beards, because some people are talking Arabic on the plane. So it's not just confined to fringe groups, is it?
No. This is part of the American story. Trump is doing what he knows how to do, which is divide and he claims he wants to make America great again, but really what he wants to do is he wants to make America white again. And we have to remember that America was not white. This was a land that belonged to the indigenous people of this country, and it belonged to the Native Americans. And we have to remember that the white people came over here from Europe, and they took the lands, stole the lands, kicked people out of their lands, killed people. And so this is a land of immigrants. And so if he can't remember where he came from and where his ancestors came from, then we've got a candidate who's running for president who's got serious amnesia. And so, you know, the Muslim community was not the first community to be targeted. We know the Italians, the Jews, the Catholics, the Japanese all had to go through this. And so one of the things that I want to highlight here is that capitalism is a system, is an economic system in which prejudice, bias, and racism is rooted in. And so when we understand these economic structures in which we're living, the whole system that we're living in, then we can understand why there is a mentality, there is a need to divide, to spread hatred and prejudice and intolerance, because it pays, it sells. People are gaining from it. And unfortunately, Islamophobia is another part of the larger, the broader issue, the broader problem.
Make the connection for us. How do things like, you know, the capitalism that you were talking about, how does it sell? How does Islamophobia sell? How does it make money? You know, just...
Well, I mean, capitalism, I mean, the whole structure of capitalism was, you know, it's to make money for the elite. So in a capitalistic structure, we have the richer continuing to get richer and the poorer are continuing to get poorer. So when 1% of the wealth is in the hand of 99% of the wealth is in the hands of the elite 1% of our country, well, we don't have an equitable, sustainable system where wealth distribution is being distributed equitably and fairly amongst. And so when we have, for example, mass incarceration, and we have the school to prison pipeline, and we have the privatization of prisons, all of this that is inculcated into our system, into our justice system, it is not about our justice system is not about putting the bad guys away anymore. It's about making money. It's not about upholding justice in society. It's about who could win, who could gain, and who could, you know, benefit on the backs of somebody else.
Well, it also takes a whole group of voting adults out of the election process. Arjun, when we look at the way law enforcement agencies are trying to counter the problem of Islamophobia and the strategies that they're trying to develop, and you've done a lot of work with them on this, it's sometimes based on some very questionable assumptions. For one, there is one assumption that the more people pray at a mosque, the more likely they are to become terrorists. Where did these come from?
Absolutely. When I think of law enforcement and its relationship with the Muslim American community, I think law enforcement in general views the Muslim American community as suspect. I'll give you 3 examples. Look at the watch listing program. You can be branded a terrorist in America based on a single Facebook or Twitter post. And as a consequence, Dearborn, Michigan has more watch-listed residents than any other city in the country except for New York. Why? Dearborn, Michigan has a very large Muslim American population.
Right.
Look at suspicious activity reporting, which asks local law enforcement to report activity they consider to be suspicious. We've had incidents where Muslim Americans have been reported to law enforcement for taking photos of bridges, for purchasing home computers at Best Buy, for playing video games online, for purchasing large pallets of water from Costco. And then you have CVE programs, countering violent extremism programs, which ask community leaders to be the eyes and ears of law enforcement and to report youth who they believe are at risk of becoming violent extremists. And the indicators that police and community leaders are using are things like being confrontational at home, ideological differences, hardly indicators at all.
Now, you know, when you say that, for instance, your name can get onto a watch list, like people you say in Dearborn, Michigan, can that be legally challenged? Because it's going to affect your life. It's going to affect the way you can, you know, go day to day.
Absolutely. So that challenge is actually now pending. There's a federal court who's looking into that issue, and we are confident that the process for challenging a name on the watch list will be improved, but we still have very little insight into how an individual is placed on the watch list, and the information we do have came through a leak a few years ago.
Because we did have that case a few years ago, I'm not sure whether you're aware of it, a case of a Malaysian professor who was here in the United States who had her name put onto the no-fly list, and when she challenged it, the state said, we cannot tell you the reasons why we put her name on the list because that would compromise state security. So how do you challenge something like that?
It's my understanding, again, that the process for challenging your designation as a terrorist through the watch listing system is being litigated,
right.
And that process is being improved.
Okay, we need to take a break right now. Has America failed its Muslim community? That's coming up next on The Heat. Stay with us.
In the Cold War, we had an ideological screening test. The time is overdue to develop a new screening test for the threats we face today. I call it extreme vetting. I call it extreme vetting.
Well, welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the rise of violence against Muslims in America. Let's get back to our panel. Nadia, what do you think of what Donald Trump just said there?
I mean, I feel like Donald Trump just emerged from the darkness of the Twilight Zone. I mean, for him to talk about extreme vetting, building a wall between U.S. and Mexico, and surveilling mosques, it's like, where have you been all these years? There's already a wall between the U.S. and Mexico. The U.S. already has an extreme vetting process for immigrants to come into this country, and mosques have been surveilled since 9/11. So I just feel like for those who understand the history of this country, who understand what this country is about, he sounds dumb.
Angie, you know, at the Democratic National Convention, we had one presentation made by Ghazalia Khan. He was the father of a soldier who was killed in action. That was a presentation that generated a great deal of news in the country, of course. It also generated a great deal of controversy. What did you make of that? Did it help or hurt the anti-Islamophobia cause?
I think that it actually probably undermined Trump quite a bit, and also Islamophobia. I think that irrespective of an individual's feelings about whether or not we should have intervened in Iraq during the Bush administration, the fact that you had these rather ordinary civilian American Muslims take the stage and deliver such an impassioned speech and make an impact the way that they did. I mean, oftentimes when their names are referenced, they're described as having stolen the show at the DNC, perhaps only second to Michelle Obama, right? And they touched so many American hearts. They were able to humanize Muslims, American Muslims, in a way that the community has struggled to do for over a decade. And so I think that irrespective of the controversy that emerged, in the aftermath of their speech that they delivered at the DNC, I think that overall, that the impact was positive for the American Muslim community. And I think more than that, Khizr and Ghazalia Khan, I think, are actually representative of this new phenomenon or trend that has emerged in the context of this presidential election season. And I'm referring specifically, again, to these sort of ordinary, untrained, low-profile members of the American Muslim community who, perhaps out of a sense of urgency, because of the escalating Islamophobia that they are seeing, that we all are seeing, are taking matters into their own hands in a very civil and legal way and pushing back against this prejudice and discrimination. So remember, perhaps the first example of that during this season is Rose Hamid, right? The American Muslim woman who's a flight attendant and mother who stood in silent protest at a Trump rally together with her Jewish compatriot with what looked like a Star of David. In doing so, she was escorted, but she escorted out of the rally, but also grabbed headlines, not just around this country, but around the world, right? And again, in this sort of, inadvertent way, helped to define who the American Muslim is. And I think that in a similar vein, that Khizr and Ghazala Khan also did the same. So ultimately, I think that we saw a positive impact.
Arjun, the incidents of violence that we see against Muslims, against Sikhs, do they fall under the broad category of hate crimes in the United States, and how is that tracked?
They do fall, and they are classified as hate crimes. The problem is that reporting of hate crimes by local law enforcement is voluntary, right? So, for example, we know that 17% of local and state law enforcement haven't reported a single hate crime in 6 years. In 2014, the FBI claims that there were a total of 6,000 hate crimes. But there are national surveys that say the number of hate crimes was closer to 600,000. So reporting of hate crimes by local and state law enforcement should be mandatory. That would increase awareness and give community leaders and local and state law enforcement the tools and resources they need to combat hate violence and bigotry.
Nadia, there was a study carried out by the New America Foundation, and there were two things that I want to talk about. One was they found that more right-wing extremists kill Americans than jihadists. That was something we talked about a moment ago. The other thing they found was that the manner in which Muslims are treated by the criminal justice system is very different from the way right-wing extremists are treated. And they found that in many instances, judges hand down harsher sentences to Muslims, longer sentences, and than they do to, say, a right-wing extremist. I mean, how widespread is that?
Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, before we speak about Muslims, we should look at what's happening to our African-American brothers in America. I mean, when a black guy and a white guy commit the very same crime, the white guy gets off with 6 months, where the black guy is in, sits and rots in jail for 25 years. So, again, this goes back to our very biased criminal justice system, our broken justice system. And so if we're going to talk about justice towards Muslims, I think we need to have a conversation around justice for everyone, and what does that look like? Our founding principles and founding fathers founded this country on justice for all. Peace, freedom, and justice for all, but that's not what we're seeing. So what our Constitution says and what is actually being handed down to Americans is very selective and based on your skin color. And I made a post on Facebook the other day, which seemed to get a lot of likes. So if it's okay,
sure,
I'll read it. This was after the killing of Khalid Jabara, the Lebanese Christian guy who was just killed, exactly, by his neighbor. How supremacy, white privilege, police selectivity, and negligence are all inculcated into our broken justice system. The rules of engagement change based on skin color, ethnicity, and the alleged religion of the perpetrator. If the criminal was black or Muslim, you would see a totally different outcome. Where's Fox News, CNN, and the like to give endless, relentless coverage of the story for the next 3 months, like they do when a so-called Muslim or a person of color pulls the trigger? Bloodshed, violence, and terror is our current reality, an inescapable nightmare. What happened to love thy neighbor and not kill thy neighbor? Oh God, please spare us from this new creed of violence.
You see, you got a lot of response to that. I'm not surprised at all. Arjun, you've seen the Shared Responsibility Committee program that the FBI is developing to counter radicalization, to counter violent extremism. What is it exactly?
A Shared Responsibility Committee is a committee that consists of a faith-based leader, a community leader, a mental health professional, and others perhaps from the social sciences, who are brought in to help a Muslim youth who is at risk of becoming a violent extremist. The problem is that the FBI's indicators for youth who are at risk of becoming violent extremists are way over-inclusive. They include things like ideological differences at home. becoming confrontational at home, deciding to attend a mosque. So as a consequence, the FBI are convening these committees to help youth who are at risk of becoming violent extremists, but there's no evidence that they are at risk of becoming violent extremists. In fact, the activities I just described not only characterize adolescents, but apart from that, they're protected under the First Amendment. So CVE programs in general treat all Muslim Americans with collective suspicion,
right.
And it's my opinion that they're a miserable failure.
Angie, very quickly, do you think anything can be done in the short term to counter this rise of Islamophobia? I've just got about 40 seconds left.
Absolutely. I think that the general elections this November is going to be a critical moment in American history vis-a-vis the American Muslim community and the future of Islamophobia. Donald Trump certainly did not invent Islamophobia, but he has exacerbated an already dangerous phenomenon, and the future of this country will be drastically affected by who we vote into office in November.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.